Honey by Sarah Weeks. Chapter 7. Things were really hopping at the beehive. By 10 o'clock there was a line of customers stretching halfway across the block. Everyone made a big fuss over the decor, and there was much oohing and eyeing over the selection of homemade nail polish colors, the 100th bottle of which BB had finished mixing at midnight the night before. Her customers were in good spirits, laughing and chatting with each other as BB flew around the salon, flitting from hand to hand, soaking, filing, clipping, buffing, and painting fingernails. That morning she gave manicures to the mayor's wife, the pharmacist's sister, a pair of identical twins, and the church organists from both the Methodist and the Presbyterian churches. Even the elderly widow of the former owner of the Frosty Bar stopped in to have her nails done. She recognized the glass bowl sitting on the counter right away. "George used to keep his sprinkles in that back in the day," she said wistfully as she plucked a bottle of ruby red polish off the shelf and held it up to the light. "Of course, I remember that too," she added, pointing to the old photograph BB had rescued from the Frosty Boy and hung on the wall behind the shampoo sink. "Once upon a time that little girl was quite famous, you know." The happy chattering of her clientele reminded BB of the flocks of catbirds that used to come to feed in her mulberry trees back in Clover Hills. She worked steadily, humming softly to herself. By noon she had managed to give 36 manicures to a total of 35 satisfied customers. The long discontent had been Teeny Nelson's mother. Mrs. Nelson had frowned at her fingernails when BB was finished painting them, and complained that her color had looked different in the bottle. BB quickly apologized and offered to start fresh with a new color, even though there were other customers waiting. Then she told Teeny to help herself to a piece of candy from the glass bowl on the counter and asked if she'd like to go say hello to the dog while her mother got her nails repainted. "Does he bite?" Teeny had asked, digging around in the candy. BB shook her head. "He's a perfect gentleman," she told Teeny, "unless you happen to be a cat. Go right down that hall and through the white door. My guess is you'll find him napping on the couch." By noon the rush was over. BB scribbled out to lunch on a piece of paper and taped it to the front door, then went back to the apartment to make herself a bite to eat. Having finally finished the chores, Nick Wu arrived at the bishop's house just in time for lunch. "I thought you'd never get here," said Melody as she led him inside. Grandpa slapped together a cup of bologna and cheese sandwiches and poured Melody and Nick each a glass of milk. "I've got some errands to do this afternoon," Melly, Grandpa said. Then he frowned and snapped his fingers. "Darn, I just remembered I left the tuna casserole in the trunk of my car. Would you mind bringing it in? The keys are on the hook by the door." "I'll come with you," said Nick. As they walked across the lawn, in the driveway, where Esmeralda, Grandpa's banged-up old white car was parked, Melody filled Nick on what Teeny had told her. "I'm telling you, it's not a coincidence," she insisted as she popped open the trunk. "Teeny Nelson was talking about my dad. He's the Henry who's been bitten by the love bug, and somebody at the beehive knows about it." Melody lifted the large Tupperware container out of the trunk. Grandpa had made enough tuna casserole to feed an army. They'd be eating leftovers for weeks. "Is it my imagination, or is that new?" Nick asked, pointing to the dent in the rear bumper. Grandpa's driving was about on par with his cooking. He backed into a fire hydrant last week," Melody explained as she slammed the trunk closed. "It came out of nowhere, like everything else he's hit." "What does your grandfather have to say about what's going on with your dad?" asked Nick. "He doesn't get it," said Melody. "He thinks the reason my dad's been acting weird is because it's the end of the school year. But I've already started a list of potential honeys. I have to know who she is." "Maybe your dad told your grandfather about his new girlfriend, but he swore him to secrecy or something," said Nick. That hadn't occurred to Melody. On their way back inside, she decided it couldn't hurt to ask. "Thanks," Grandpa said when Melody set the heavy container on the counter. "I'll take it from here. But first I'm going out to the garage." "To look for the hammer?" asked Nick. Grandpa shook his head. "Don't you get started with me, young man," he said, unhooking the oxygen tube and draping it over the back of a chair. "Before you go," said Melody, "can I ask you something?" "Fire away," Grandpa told her. "Has Dad mentioned anything to you about having a girlfriend?" Melody studied her grandfather's face carefully as he answered. She'd played enough games of gin rummy with him to know that his eyebrows twitched when he was being shifty about something. "If your father has a girlfriend, it's news to me," Grandpa said, his eyebrows unmoving. "What makes you think he might?" "All the signs are there," Nick chimed in. "You said yourself you noticed Dad's socks didn't match," Melody pointed out. Grandpa laughed. This from the person who gave me grief about a non-sequitur? Listen, Millie. I'm like your father. I'd like your father to find someone special as much as you would, but if he was seeing somebody, he would have told us. Mark my words, the minute he's done with school, he'll straighten up and fly right again. Like I said, Melody told Nick after her grandfather had left, he doesn't get it. She got a bottle of chocolate syrup out of the fridge and put a generous squirt in her glass. Then she tilted her head back and squirted a long stream of chocolate directly into her mouth. Jenny would kill me if she saw me do that, said Nick. Jenny was Nick's stepmother. You want some, Melody asked Nick. He nodded and held out his glass. Where is this beehive place anyway? He asked. The name had rung a bell as soon as Teeny had said it. Melody had seen the advertisement for the grand opening on the yellow flyer her father had written his note on the back of. It's where the old Frosty boy used to be, she told Nick. As soon as we're done eating, I think we should go over there and snoop around a little. Nick hesitated. I've never been to a beauty parlor before, he said. Neither have I, admitted Melody. But all we're going to do is go in, ask a few questions, and get out. What if someone tries to paint my fingernails or something? Nick asked. Don't worry, Melody assured him. I'll protect you. They carried their milk and sandwiches out onto the front porch. You know what I've been thinking lately? Asked Nick, sitting down next to Melody on the top steps. Water towers. What about them? Melody had always been rather fond of the shiny metal mushroom-shaped tower that stood on the edge of town. She especially liked it the way it had "Welcome to Royal" written across the top in loopy blue script. Every town around here has one, but how do you know for sure there's water inside? Asked Nick. Why would anyone bother to build a water tower if they weren't going to put water inside it? Asked Melody. Good question, said Nick. Another thing I'd like to know is why they need to have all those antennas and blinking lights on top. Melody took a bite of her sandwich and licked a drift of mustard off her thumb. Why don't you Google it? She asked. I've Googled it, Binged it, and asked Jeeves. They all say the same thing, but I'm not convinced. What do you mean? Asked Melody. What if it's some kind of plot? What if these so-called water towers are actually full of alien creatures with see-through rooms and huge boogity eyeballs, sending messages back and forth because they're planning to take over the world? Have you completely lost it, Woo? Melody laughed. You sound certifiable. Go ahead and mock me if you want, Nick told her, but don't blame me when you're lying in your bed some night and a slimy green tentacle dripping with ectoplasmic ooze comes dripping through your window and grabs you by the neck. Can we please stop talking about aliens and get back to the subject on my father's new girlfriend? Asked Melody. Maybe honeys and aliens, said Nick. Did you ever think of that? Only you would think of that. Besides, I doubt my dad would fall for someone with boogity eyeballs and a see-through brain. Nick gulped down half of his chocolate milk and wiped his mouth on his sleeve. What did the person look like who said the thing about Henry and the love bug? He asked, peeling the crust of one half of his sandwich and popping it in his mouth. Teeny doesn't remember who said it, but whoever it was knows my dad, Melody said. Nick wasn't so sure. Henry's a pretty common name, he said. How do you know they weren't talking about some other guy? Did you bring your phone? Melody asked. She didn't have a cell phone, neither did her father. In fact, they didn't even have a home computer. Henry Bishop had strong feelings about screen time. Melody wasn't allowed to watch TV at all on weekdays, and she only got 2 hours of viewing time on weekends. I'm starved, said Nick through a mouthful of bologna and cheese. Can it wait until after we finish eating? One look at Melody's face told him the answer. Nick set down his sandwich, reached into his back pocket, and pulled out his phone. Tapping in the search information, he waited. Nick loved his phone. When he first got it, he'd spent hours trying out different names for the built-in electronic personal assistant to call him. Finally, he settled in on Your Majesty. Nick typed in a few searches, then turned to Melody, satisfied. You'll be happy to know that according to this, there's only one Henry in Royal Indiana, he told her, and it's your dad. Now all we have to do is track down the love bug who bit him. Chapter 8. Mo was sitting on the living room rug, scratching an itch behind his left ear. That morning, after a long walk, the tall woman had brought him home. After filling Mo's bowl with fresh water, she'd given him a raw hide knot and left, closing the door behind her. There were strangers around, all women. They clucked and cackled like a bunch of chickens, but at least they were quieter than the men who'd been showing up every day for weeks with their noisier tools. All that pounding and buzzing had made Mo want to throw back his head and howl. When he and the tall woman had lived in the cabin beside the river, life had been more peaceful. The only sounds Mo heard were the birds singing and the wind in the trees at night. He had enjoyed chasing grasshoppers and rolling in the patch of sweet clover near his favorite shade tree. He'd spent many happy hours burying soup bones under that tree. By now the dopey old beaker down the road had probably come and dug them all up. The tall woman seemed happier since the move. She hummed all the time, but Mo hadn't made up his mind yet about the new place. He felt nervous and on edge all the time now, as if something were about to happen. But what? It didn't help matters that there was a cat hanging around. Mo heard him yelling in the middle of the night, and even though Mo barked whenever the big orange cat showed himself, the cat had still left his musky scent all over the yard. Mo hated the smell of cat even more than he hated getting a bath. Fortunately, the tall woman had been too busy lately to think about bathing Mo, or clipping his nails, another thing he hated. Mo would be vigilant. Eventually the cat would get cocky, the way cats always did, and Mo would chase him up a tree and show him who was boss. Mo chewed on the rawhide knot for a while, and when he grew tired of that, he curled up on the couch to take a nap. He had just closed his eyes when he heard someone open the door. The step was unfamiliar, lighter and quicker than the tall woman's. A minute later, a little girl peeked around the corner. She had long yellow hair, and when she tipped back her head and laughed, Mo's breath quickened and his heart began to race. It was her, the girl from this dream. Mo knew what was going to happen next. She would run to him and throw her arms around his neck, but instead, to his surprise, the girl skipped across the room and pat him gingerly on the head. Her fingers were sticky and smelled of root beer, and she was shorter and rounder than she was supposed to be. She laughed again and then turned and skipped away. Mo didn't bother at all. She wasn't his girl. She wasn't his girl at all. Chapter 9. See, said Melody excitedly, I told you it wasn't a coincidence. The Henry that Teeny was talking about was definitely my dad. A car horn beeped, and Nick and Melody looked up to see Roxanne Jenkins sailing by in a red SUV. Julia Jenkins and Teeny Nelson were buckled up next to each other in the back seat on their way home from ballet class. Melody waved, and Roxanne waved back. Maybe she's Honey, Nick suggested. I already put her on the list, Melody told him. You remember the pound cake, right? When Melody was a little girl, Roxanne and her husband had split up. One day she showed up on the bishop's doorstep with a homemade pound cake and a lot of eye makeup on. Later, Melody's father had explained that Roxanne had come on a fishing expedition. What was she trying to catch, Daddy? Melody had asked. Me, I suppose, he'd said. Do you want her to catch you? No, Melody's father had told her. I don't. I do, Melody had said, licking her lips. That pound cake was delicious. Now Melody and Nick watched the red SUV turn the corner and disappear behind a row of hedges. Who else is on your list? Asked Nick. That woman, Nancy, I told you about, who hugged my dad in the grocery store, and Miss Berg. The lady at the library who wears those funny red glasses? Asked Nick incredulously. Love is blind, Melody told him. Lucky for Miss Berg, he said. Can you think of anyone else you could add to the list? Asked Melody. What about my neighbor Bethany Mitchell? Said Nick. She's not married, and there's definitely nothing wrong with the way she looks. She might look okay, but have you ever heard her talk? Melody asked. She says supposedly and anyways. Her father would never be interested in someone who spoke that way. I still think you should add her to the list, said Nick. Melody sighed. Fine, she's in the running. Maybe your dad met Honey on one of those dating websites. That's how my dad and Jenny got together. Nick's parents had gotten divorced when he and Melody were in second grade, and his dad had remarried a year later. Nick loved Jenny, and Melody thought she was great too, and not just because she made a good chocolate chip cookies. I tried to talk my dad into doing online dating once, Melody told Nick. I even came up with a screen name for him, Word Nerd, but he refused to try it. Why do you think your dad hasn't told you he's seeing someone? Asked Nick, flicking a crumb off his knee. I don't know, but I'm sure he has a reason. He never does anything without thinking it through first. Nick stood up. Speaking of food, he said, I could use another sandwich. Who was speaking of food? Asked Melody. Oh, said Nick. I guess I was just thinking about it. Well, stop thinking about it, said Melody, grabbing Nick's hand and pulling down the steps. We have some detective work to do. It was about a 10-minute bike ride from the bishop's house to the beehive. As they pedaled past the high school, Melody happened to glance over at Nick and noticed that he was chewing on his bottom lip. What's the matter? She asked. Nothing, he said. Hello, this is your best friend talking. You think I don't know what it means when you chew on your lip? What's wrong? It's just, well, I think I might have come up with a theory about why your dad doesn't want to tell you who he's been seeing, but I warn you, you're not going to like it. I promise not to shoot this messenger, Melody said. What does that mean? It means you should tell me your theory, and I won't blame you if I don't like it. Okay, said Nick. Here goes. Maybe the reason your dad doesn't want you to know who he's seeing is because he's afraid you won't be happy about it. I've been wanting this forever, said Melody. Why wouldn't I be happy about it? What if Honey is someone your dad knows you don't like? I mean, really, really, really don't like. Like who, for instance? Asked Melody. Nobody in particular, said Nick. It's just a theory. Melody shook her head. I don't buy it. If I don't like someone, he probably wouldn't like them either. Yeah, you're probably right. Like I said, it was just a theory. They'd come to a steep hill, so they got off their bikes and started walking them up. Do you want to stay for dinner tonight? Melody asked. Sure, Nick said. You may regret that decision when you taste Grandpa's tuna noodle casserole. It's truly vile. I'm just glad to be here. I almost got grounded this weekend. Why? Asked Melody. Why do you think? Oh, because of the math test? Melody guessed. It wasn't our fault we got so many wrong, he said as they got back on their bikes. Miss Hogan deliberately tried to trick us. I wish we could have had Miss McKenna again this year. I told my dad the exact same thing. Remember when Mrs. McKenna took us to the museum to see that dinosaur? Asked Nick. Melody nodded. Dracorex Hogwartsia. She still had the picture of Nick and her posing in front of the skeleton with their arms draped around each other's shoulders. It was pinned to the bulletin board that hung above the desk in her room. That was the coolest thing ever, Nick said. No, Melody corrected. Mrs. McKenna was the coolest thing ever. My dad told me she and Miss Hogan are friends. No way, shouted Nick. Miss Hogan is the opposite of Mrs. McKenna, said Melody. She doesn't think anything is funny. On the rare occasion when she actually smiles, she looks like she's in pain. And Miss Hogan definitely wouldn't have done something amazing like take the whole class to Indianapolis Children's Museum to see a 66-million-year-old dinosaur named after something from Harry Potter. You can say that again, Nick agreed. As they glided around the corner side by side on their bikes, the beehive came into view. Holy moly, exclaimed Nick. Check out the big bee. But Melody wasn't looking at the bee. She was looking at a woman in a navy blue wraparound dress who was walking up the sidewalk in their direction. She couldn't quite put her finger on it, but there was something very familiar about her. She had on a straw hat with a wide floppy brim, so Melody wasn't able to see her whole face, but she could tell by the way the woman was pursing her lips that she was whistling. As she got closer, Melody caught a snippet of the tune. You are my sunshine, my only sunshine. Who is that? Melody asked Nick. They both watched as the woman in the straw hat crossed the street and headed up the front walk to the beehive. Just before she opened the door, she paused and took off their hat. Melody gasped. Speak of the devil, said Nick. It's Miss Hogan.